All right, welcome back to Managing Windows Microsoft Virtualization with System Center and Hyper-V. Corey Hines and Simon Perryman. Moving into Module 9, Configuring and Managing the VMM Library. Now, before we do, two quick housekeeping items that we want to address. Number one, so a lot of you guys out there, and I know there's a lot of questions coming in, and we're doing our best to answer them. So I've seen people say, hey, how come you're not answering my questions? As we're reading them, we know, a lot of times we know that that's coming up later on. So we're kind of trying to address the things, questions on clarification on what we've already covered to make sure we can get that brought up. And we try to address things, as best we can. And, if we see stuff, I write them down and we try to address them here. And secondly, if you're asking a question that is very specific to, hey, in my network, this server had this error in it, why is that happening? We don't know. We're not product support, we're training. So, if it's very, very specific on a very specific error, we probably can't address that live in the chat or online. So just kind of bear that in mind and try to focus your questions on, what we've already covered and things you feel that you'd like more clarification on, because that we certainly can do and can address. And if your question isn't being answered, then chances are we just haven't gotten to it, or we feel like it's going to come up later on. It's going to get addressed a little bit later on.
TechNet Forums is a great place if you do have those very specific questions about your particular environment. TechNet Forums get viewed by the product group, by MVPs, and you usually get a pretty quick response on those. And another benefit is you get to share that with the community. You write down your exact question. That's going to get archived so that future people browsing for that problem in the forums will also get to see it. So specific questions, definitely want to encourage you to check out the TechNet Forums.
So moving into Module 9 for today, which is Configuring and Managing the VMM Library. So for this particular module, what we're looking at is the library as the building block for what you work with in Virtual Machine Manager. So when you go to deploy new virtual machines and new VMs, rather than new virtual machines and new VMs, both of those completely different things. When you go to do that, you don't have to answer the same questions over and over and over and over again. You can define templates that represent common configurations, common collections of settings, and deploy those. And you can do this, for operating systems, for hardware, for switches, for all sorts of different elements. So we'll take a look at the library, the objects in the library, the assorted types of profiles, and the assorted types of templates. So,
all right, let's kick it off. Now, first thing, just to clarify in terminology, profile. What is a profile? It's a template. It's that simple. We kind of treat templates in two different ways, whether we store them actually on a disk or whether we treat it as an XML definition file. And basically, profiles are XML definitions. Templates are components we can reuse. Bottom line, it's the same thing, a profile, same thing as a template here. Our first thing we're going to do, our first lesson, is take a look at the actual VMM library itself. So what is the VMM library? So it's basically a file share that stores resources that VMM might want to use. It organizes them, it categorizes them, and it includes a variety of different components like ISO files, VHDs, and we'll go take a look at some of those in a little bit. Now, it also supports data deduplication, and this is one of the best uses of Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2 file server deduplication. If you have a lot of images that are structured the same way, let's say, for example, you have 20 VHDs, they're all different versions of Windows Server. Using data deduplication can save you a ton of space on that library server by simply maintaining a single instance of that. As we look at the different library resources that are included, we have our file-based resources, which are actually the physical components stored on a disk, which can include ANSI files and drivers, hard drives, VHDs, PowerShell and SQL scripts, web deployment packages, and SQL DAC packs or SQL data availability component files. Additionally, we have different templates and profiles for VMs and some other types of resources we can manage. And we'll actually walk through each of these individually in a little bit. Now, the way you want to think about logically deploying your library servers are having one at each site. And the reason for this is to minimize traffic over a WAN link. So you have a single data center, you're probably fine having a single library server, because if you're deploying a 20 gigabyte VHD file, it's still staying local within your network. But if you have multiple branch offices, you're probably going to want to have a library server at each of those offices. This way, if you're deploying a 20 gig VM to your office based in London, you're just deploying it from a file server based in London. You're not copying that 20 gigabytes over the public internet. Now, this will not only speed up deployment and reduce network bandwidth time, but you can actually give better control, delegated control to each of the file servers for each of those admins at those different sites or locations. Now, the library servers are built using Windows file servers. And so, actually, one last thing I want to mention regarding having multiple library servers. You can use built-in replication technologies for file servers as well. So if you have a bunch of files stored at your primary data center, you want to make sure those get replicated to the file server located in London or located in the south. You can actually use DFS replication to actually go and replicate those files across these different locations.
Yeah, I can use clusters for this as well, right?
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, it's just a file server.
Absolutely. So how do we use clusters? Well, we use a traditional Windows Server failover cluster with the file server in role stored. So it can be made highly available as well. And so if you're doing lots of deployments, having high availability for the library server is nice. Production environments, we don't necessarily see it that often. We really see people use high availability on their library servers if they have a truly dynamic environment where they need to dynamically scale up. And so what I mean by that is they're the type of private cloud consumer that's constantly monitoring their VMs. And if one of those VMs starts to reach, high capacity, then it will go and create a new VM from the library, do that kind of scale out operation. Those are the customers that we really see take advantage of the high availability the most, because they're the ones that always need access to that library server. If you just deploy a couple VMs a week or a couple VMs a month, you're kind of doing it manually, probably don't need to make that library server highly available. Our second lesson here is actually taking a look at our different profiles and templates.
So when you start, getting into working in the library in particular, you'll find that there's a lot of objects that you can actually create, right?
Yep.
So just jump back for a second. The list there: hardware profiles, guest profiles, server app v profiles, app profiles, SQL Server. These all represents kind of the most common things that people deploy with VMM, and every one of those is a different object with its own characteristics and properties, and you stitch all these objects together. It's kind of like big old Lego blocks to build, to build services and VMs. So as an example, you take, for example, a high-spec server hardware profile, add the Windows Server 22 operating system profile with SQL Server on top of that, and those three things gives you the full deployment of the VM.
Absolutely. Great piece. Great way to look at it. These are the building blocks to go create these larger objects. Now, hardware profiles, guest OS profiles, AppV application profiles, SQL profiles. Rather than go through these slides, let's just show you in our demo exactly what all these different pieces are. Now, back on our demo screen as we switch over here, just to wrap up the last section, our cluster has now been validated. So if I take a look at the status, it'll give me a link to the cluster validation report. I can get more information about it. If I go take a look at my available storage, I see those disks are online. My file shares are now online. And my CSV disk that I've added is now online. Now, if I went back and take a look at the actual failover cluster, here you go. You can now see that this is now being mapped. It's being refreshed. We see our different disks and our CSV volume. Final thing I'm going to do is convert these two disks over to CSV. So we've taken disks from available storage and now made them CSV disks. Let's save that. There we go. Now let's move down to our library setting. And again, you're going to be using the library workspace. When you go and actually interact with these resources, you're going to deploy again and again. So before we go through this, what we're actually going to do is go and add a new share. Now, I have two library servers. SCVMM will go and install a library server by default and include a few samples for you. And so the default library server is always going to get installed under SCVMM01, whatever your local server is, and then under the MS SCVMM library. Within this, you get some application frameworks. So these are some resources that you can deploy, a server AppV package and a web package, and then a few sample VHDs as well. So two VHDs, two VHDX files. So this comes as default. You can delete this, never have to worry about it again if you want. Now here's the file server that I actually did add. Now I've gone through this already, I've gone through the add library server, specify the name and the location. And so in this case, we're just going to go and add a new share within this library server. So remember, there's two parts to this. One is adding the library server, one is adding the shares within that library server. So I'm going to go add a new share, and in this case, I'm going to go and add my share for VMware. What I've done is I've stored a couple of VMware objects in here that we're actually going to go and convert to Hyper-V objects a little later in the day. So we're going to say I want access to this VMware share. Take a look at the script, get the credential, add the new library share, click Create. And now our library share has been added. So down here, we can now see I have this new library share called VMware. And within this library, we actually have a VMware virtual machine. So if I take a look at the components of this new VM, you see under virtualization platform, VMware ESX server. Now let's just go take a look under the covers what we're actually doing here. So I'm actually going to go navigate to that share itself. And here you have an offline VMware virtual machine with the associated VMDK file, VMSD, VMX, VMXF, and then the .lck. So you can see this is basically an offline virtual machine that we can now, from VMware, that we can now manage using Hyper-V. Sorry, using Virtual Machine Manager. Too many V's in this conversation here. Okay, so we've now got and added this new VM. Next thing we're going to go and take a look at now are the different resources that we can go and manage in our library. So with the existing library share that we've added, first thing we'll take a look at is application frameworks. And so these are these resources that we can go and add as part of application packages. We're going to actually go into a little more detail in a second, so hold on with a clarification on that. Second thing we have added to our library share is the configuration for a service that we're going to deploy. This service is going to have a website. So we've actually gone and pre-created some web application packages. And these essentially contain the configuration information needed for our IIS server to go and run this front-end web page.
So service templates, they're a little bit more complex, right? So we're going to be covering those a little bit
later.
We'll
be covering them, yep. We're covering them later this afternoon.
So service templates, as a sort of a quick sort of definition, would be multiple VMs grouped together to provide a collective service. So
like an enterprise application.
Exactly. So whereas you would use a hardware profile and an operating system profile and an application profile to build a VM, you could then have 3 or 4 VMs with different combinations of things defined as a service.
That's right. And you can control the startup order, the different tiers, scale out, scale down,
elasticity,
update domains. So a lot of flexibility within the services. Back to our library here, though. Other resources that we're now able to manage are these SQL DAC packs. So this is for our data tier application package. And it basically contains pre-configured information for a SQL server that we're going to deploy. Then we have a few scripts that we can run. So we've even added scripts as part of our library. These could be SQL Server scripts, run once scripts, pre-installation, post-installation scripts, kind of whatever you want here. And a little later on today as well, we're going to go and actually add some PowerShell scripts we create and go use them out of this library. So that kind of gives you an overview of the core library resources we can manage. And now we will take a look at the VHDs. Now, what we've done with our VHDs here, these are some VHDs that we've imported. And if you take a look at the file type, they're all VHDX, all on the same library server. But what's interesting here is that these actually cover a variety of different guest operating systems. And so we essentially have this guest operating system pre-installed on this VHD. So here I have my CentOS 6.4 Linux distribution, Oracle Oracle 6.4, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE, Ubuntu. We have a SQL Server disk, so if I'm going to go deploy a SQL Server, I can get that pre-configured. My Windows 8.1 client, and then 3 different Windows Server VHDs. One for my file role, one for my Active Directory role, and one for my web role. And so these VHDs basically pre-configured, and I can go use them again and again and again. And each time I deploy it, it will go actually take a clone of that VHD. Now, one thing that I've actually done here, these are actually empty VHDs, so these don't have the full operating system. And so if you actually look at the size of them, you can see they're very small. And we're just doing this for the purpose of the demo so that we can deploy them, copy them, clone them very quickly. Now, final thing we're going to cover as part of this module is this concept of profiles. Profiles we've alluded to a few times as kind of these predefined templates for configuration. Now, very first profile we're going to take a look at here is what we call a capability profile. Now, there's 3 pre-configured capability profiles which are added within VMM. So these came pre-installed. There's one for ESX, VMware, one for Xen, Citrix, and one for Hyper-V. So if we kind of take a look at the details of this, essentially all this is saying is, hey, this particular type of profile must use this target platform. Basically, we're saying if your host is using Hyper-V, we need to make sure we use this profile. But we don't care about the number of processors. We don't care about the amount of memory. Anything with that's flexible. The second type of profile we want to take a look at is our physical computer profile. Now, in Virtual Machine Manager 2012 RTM and Service Pack 1, these were actually called host profiles. They've been renamed in 2012 R2 to physical computer profile, but they're essentially the same thing. So let's go take a look at what a physical computer profile is. Now, this is actually a template that we will go and apply to a physical server that could be a virtualization host, or in this case, one of my SQL hosts, and we predefine how it's going to be connected. So what parent disk is it using? What is it booting from? What type of NICs can it be connected to? Is it going to be using DHCP or IP, or static IPs? What's the domain? Password? What are we going to call these? Product key, time zone, and then some scripts that we can run. Finally, under the host settings, we could go and add paths for the actual VMs that are going to be part of this. And so in this case, we're going to actually be deploying this as like a SQL cluster. We're going to go ahead and use cluster shared volume. So we predefine that path. So one more time, a host profile is a template for a physical server that we're going to configure. So, excuse me. So we've now kind of covered the 2 profiles which cover the physical components, which is your capability profile for the hypervisor, the physical computer profile. The next 4 profiles we're going to be covering are for virtual machines. Very first one we're going to take a look at here is the hardware profile of our virtual machine. And so this is essentially defining what the VM's virtual hardware looks like: memory, disks, network connections.
Now, in the hardware profile, as they're kind of going back to some of the things that we were looking at this morning, as you created, is there any association back with objects like storage classifications, network classifications, or does that come later as you deploy the VM?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. Do you know on this part?
I don't know.
I don't know if we could configure it this early. You know what? Let's just answer the question. Yes, we can. So I'll go take a look at my network connection, and sure enough, down here we can go and connect to one of our existing networks. So here's the virtual network we created. So depending on the order that you build this, yes, you can.
Okay.
So let's take a look at this hardware profile here. Now, again, this is the hardware for our virtual machine, so this is all virtualized hardware. We're going to say this runs in Hyper-V. This is going to be our SQL VM, so we're going to give it 32 processors, and we've turned on processor compatibility mode. As a reminder, this allows you to do live migration between hosts that have slightly different processor versions still running within the same family. So Intel Step 5, Intel Step 7. We get to define our memory, and we can define the dynamic memory settings here. So our minimum memory, our startup memory, our maximum memory, and the memory percentage buffer, so how much we're gradually
So for those that were tuned in tomorrow, this is the exact same stuff that we did when we created a VM. So when we made the VM, we did all this.
It's, very similar.
Right,
yep.
and by now creating a hardware profile, we're predefining what we want as different types of settings. If we want certain levels of RAM, and so as we define those, we don't, you don't have to worry about a person, who's going and deploying a VM, creating a VM with 32 gigs of RAM. You don't want that. You just define profiles, big, medium, small. And much like Azure does, for example, they have certain sizes of VMs, and you just pick the size that you want. Works much the same way as they deploy VMs and you define the profiles. They pick the profile that they want based on what they have permission to, using the delegation and the tenant technology that you talked about earlier.
Yep. And one thing we see a lot of admins do using these predefined hardware profiles is kind of what we call breaking up the hardware into STAMs. And really what that means is compact logical units that can scale. So small might be 4 gigs of RAM, medium might be 8 or 16 gigs of RAM, large might be 32 or 64 gigs of RAM. But what you see these admins do as the best practice is make sure that they're divisible, or they have a lowest common denominator. That way you can easily think, hey, if I need a large, that's equivalent to 4 smalls. So that kind of helps you with the scaling and helps you really try to best utilize the space on a particular host.
Really good question came up. When you're defining processors, is that cores or sockets, or what is that? And the answer, I'll go ahead and just answer that one. The processor count is essentially the number of squares you see in Task Manager. Right? So don't even think so much of cores, sockets, processors. You go into Task Manager and it's showing 32 cores. You can go up to 32 processors on the machine.
Thanks. So we get to also define, the standard stuff, floppy drives. I'm sure all our VMs are going to use those. COM ports, network adapters. And then under actual networks, this is where we can go and connect it to an existing network here. So,
right, and you notice that in doing this, you're connecting it. You have no knowledge of what the underlying physical topology is. You just know that, okay, there's a network for the data center, and I don't need to worry about where it's plugged in. I'm just going to pick the network for the data center.
Absolutely.
And and VMM will figure out where it can put the VM so it has that connection. So this is a required network connection. It'll find one.
Yep. And so in this case, we're going to just have some flexibility, not require this particular VM template to run on that particular network. So we'll keep that disabled. Now, you get the ability, if you have fiber channel HBAs, you could configure them here. But we also have some advanced features here under availability. So you have this checkbox to make this virtual machine highly available. And what this means is when it's looking at host placement, it's only going to recommend hosts that are part of a cluster. Because if it's not part of a cluster, that VM's not highly available. And here's the same standard VM prioritization features that you would see back in Hyper-V. We then get to enter some additional configurations such as VM priority as compared to other VMs on that host, virtual NUMA, non-uniform memory access, and memory weight, how much memory priority it gets in relation to everything on that host. We could configure dependencies, who can access this particular template, and then it will actually either go and validate errors within this profile. So that's gone and defined the virtual hardware for our VM. Let's actually take a look inside our guest operating system and take a look at the profile of our guest OS. So at a general, this is the guest operating system for SQL. What we can do within our guest OS profile is actually define which operating system it's going to use. You can see quite a lot here, all the different Windows operating systems. Under identity information, this is where you can go and predefine the series of names that will be used by these VMs. And two little tricks here that could come up as exam questions. You want to make sure that you're either using the hashtag symbol or the asterisk wildcard symbol. And these represent different things. Now, if you think that you're going to be deploying multiple VMs, you need to make sure you give them unique names. And so if you just had, a pet shop SQL, you could deploy one. When you tried to deploy the second, you'd get a conflict. If you use the hash, what it will do is increment numbers for you. So this will go from, 1 through 9. If you do 2 hashes, it'll go through 1 through 99.
Can you zoom it on that one?
Yeah.
Just to see it, so people can just kind of see what it is. There you go.
Now, the other option you have is if you want to use a wildcard character, meaning it's a randomly assigned character, you could go use the asterisk. So again, hashtag is for incremental numbers, asterisk is for wildcard. We can then go configure our admin settings, product keys, time zones. But here's the one that's going to save you a lot of time. This is predefining the features and roles.
This is utterly fantastic.
Well, why don't you explain how you use this while I just kind of browse the interface?
Well, so if you scroll down through, this is everything that's in Server Manager. right? So all the roles that you might want installed on the machine. So rather than you having to install the operating system and then worry about scripting the installation of things like file servers, you just go in here and check the boxes you would check in Server Manager to get the features that you want. For example, you can check Hyper-V. Although if this were a VM, you wouldn't check Hyper-V. But that happened to be one that was on the screen. But for example, the file services or Active Directory services or a web server, the most common things you'll typically use this for are file servers and web servers. But it's just a matter of, this is what you would have done in Server Manager. It makes it so easy. You just check the boxes for the features that you want and you're set.
Save you a lot of time, and some of these features require an additional reboot. Skip that additional work. Take a look at our Active Directory credentials. We can join this VM to the domain using our domain join. And then you have the ability to go and run scripts as well. So first time that the VM starts up, first times it runs, go execute a script. So that has gone and defined our guest OS profile. So we've gone and defined the virtual hardware and now the virtual operating system. Next two things we're going to look at is our SQL profile and our application profile, because these are things that we actually go and inject within these VMs. So inject in applications such as websites, inject in SQL configuration information like your SQL servers. So let's start with an application profile here. So as we look at the application configuration, we get to define OS compatibility. So every time I want to deploy this application, what are the requirements for the operating system it runs on? And so in this particular case, this app can go run on Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, or 2012 R2. We could then go and add scripts. So you could go and add a custom script. And this will go and actually execute a script in the environment, like clearing DNS as a script. You could go add your SQL Server data tier packages. So you could browse and add SQL DAC packs, and this will actually pull the DAC packs out of your library, make them available with the template. You could go define the SQL instance names, different types of authentications, run as accounts, and even how it's installed, the different types of modes.
Now, if you've ever attempted to do an auto install of SQL Server, it's not a trivial thing. They've got some tools that do it. You can do like a recorded installation wizard, then like a playback with a command, but the reality is it's not an easy thing to do. This makes it easy to do, right? Because SQL is such an integral part of deploying application level services.
Yep.
So making SQL easy to deploy is pretty important to this overall process.
Absolutely. And so as part of this configuration, you can even define the service account. So as this gets installed and configured, what is it running under? What's the agent running under? What's the reporting server running under? Under configuration, who are the admins that can access it? Where is the actual media located? What type of connections are we using? What run as accounts? What security modes? And then finally, or perhaps most importantly, what's the name of the SQL instance, the database, the SQL IDs? And then who's going to run the installation. So this allows you to predefine the SQL configuration steps as well. So as we kind of looked across these different pieces here, we can define our clouds, we can define our physical computers, we can define the hardware for our virtual machines, the operating system for our virtual machines, and then those applications and SQL services running within the VMs. These are our building blocks for actually creating a VM. And this is the next thing that we are going to do. So
one of the questions that's come up now a couple of times in here, and I think you're about to answer it, so if you've asked this, pay attention, frankly. Profile versus template. And what's the difference between a profile object and a template? And so I believe this is what you're getting to now, correct?
It is, yep. So we'll go through this. Profiles are essentially the individual building blocks. Template is a collection of profiles. Essentially, they're the same thing. It's really just kind of looking at
economy of scale.
The economy of scale, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Conceptually, consider them the same things. Profiles make up templates. Now, what we're going to do here is go and create a VM template. And this is basically going to pull together those four virtualized components. So the applications, the guest OS, the hardware profile, and the SQL Server profile. We are not going to go and deploy it, configure a cloud because it's not part of the cloud, though we can say what type of host it should run on. And we're not going to be defining the physical computer profile because We're not actually building a physical computer.
So in terms of the, I think it believes not the physical computer profile, but the capability profile. One example of where that is quite often used is whether or not the physical machine has a remote FX capable graphics adapter or not. So if you're going to be deploying VMs that are going to need that graphics adapter, or for example, if you're deploying to hosts that need an HBA adapter, you can use that capability profile to limit the host based on the hardware it may or may not have. So just some examples where that's really used.
Great tip there.
And with the scenario that I just described, which is something to the extent of I need to limit where something is going to go based on a physical characteristic of it, what object should I use, might be something that you should be able to answer.
Good tip. So with our VM templates, let's go and create a new VM template. So first question is, are we going to go and edit an existing template, or are we going to base things on a VHD stored in our library, or are we just going to go deploy this from scratch? Now in this case, what we're actually going to go and do is we are going to go, let me just double check, make sure I'm creating the right one. We've created our web tier already. We're now going to go and create our SQL tier. So we're going to use basically define all these different pieces that will fit into our SQL VM. So I'm actually going to browse and pick our SQL VHD. And so this is Windows Server 2012, running SQL. So now we defined VHD. Now we get to create our template. So this is pet shop application, SQL. We can say whether it's a Generation 1 or Generation 2 VM. We'll stay with Gen 1. And now this is where we go and actually get to inject these different building blocks that we've created. For our hardware profile, we're going to go and add that hardware profile for the SQL VM we just reviewed. And if you take a look at all these parameters, it goes and copies it in. This way, I'm guaranteed that everything is configured correctly. Built the standardization directly in. Availability high, CPU priority high, memory weight high. We've reviewed these already. And we'll see that this is going to be deployed onto our Hyper-V host. Now, what's nice about this as well is if I don't ever want to use a profile, I don't have to. I can go create a new one from scratch. Or if I want to tweak an existing profile, I can say, let me use the SQL profile. I'm going to go change that maximum memory down to 16. So even though you can start with an existing profile, you can still go and edit it as well. Now, next thing we go and take a look at is the guest OS. So let's go and add our guest OS profile that we've just reviewed.
So this is where these profiles become really, really convenient, right? You're not configuring anything. You're just picking what's pre-configured. And in terms of, when you begin to define self-service, this is what you allow users to do, is you simply say, hey, you're allowed to deploy a VM, but you're only allowed to pick what I already defined for you. You can't get really custom with it. So you can define things that are, essentially safe. One of the questions that popped up here, just kind of a minute ago was, wow, it seems like a lot of work to deploy a VM, creating all these. You don't have to do all of this, right? You can just go make a VM. And if you just
we'll do that soon as well.
If you just go make a VM, you can specify everything. So you can just run a wizard and make a VM. You don't have to do all this to make a VM. But if you're deploying this, as a framework to manage everything, to do self-service, then that's where the profiles and the templates become extremely valuable as those basic blocks that you can choose from rather than having to be specific about every single time.
Yeah, think about it this way. Let's say you're deploying 30 VMs, one a week. They're configured similarly. And each time you go through these steps, click here, then click here, then click here. There's like 50 steps here. That's a lot of chance for misconfiguration. Even if you've done it correctly the first 20 times, hey, people get lazy. People make mistakes, right? You're no longer going to read those step-by-steps. And then that causes misconfigurations. That wastes time doing troubleshooting, support, figuring out, why doesn't this VM work anymore? It worked last week. Why is it not working this week? That's the benefit of the standardization in these templates. It's that guaranteed configuration eliminating the human error. You know that the problem's not in the VM or the template. And so that way, if there's a problem, we can go blame our developers because they've written bad code this time. They're no longer going to be complaining about the infrastructure. So templates, a lot of advantage for troubleshooting. And ultimately, yes, it's an investment up front in your time, but it should pay dividends in the long run if you're doing this again and again.
You go blame the developers and let me know how that works out for you.
I will. I always do.
All I never blame the developers. They can do things to you.
So next thing we're going to look at here is our application that's going to be running inside our VM. We're going to go deploy SQL app and got our same settings, our same scripts. And finally, our SQL installation. Oops, went to double-click there. SQL installation, SQL configuration, click Next, click Create, and this will now go and create our profile. So we've gone and created this brand new template. Let's go and take a look at our VM templates. And sure enough, here is this brand new template that we've just created. If we take a look at the properties, we can go down, take a look at everything which is pre-configured. Now, if you ever want to go change these templates later, look at that. You can even go and switch them. You can go edit them after they've been created. So trying to keep this flexible.
Can you copy paste templates? I don't know. It just occurred to me. I think you can, can't you?
You can export and import
okay.
them. That's how you do that.
Functionally
Export
equivalent.
and import.
There you go. Functionally equivalent.
Well, this wraps up our module here. We've now gone and really gone through all of our different templates. Now, last thing that we're going to just mention very briefly is services. We talked about this already. Service being this collection of templates. We have a whole module designed on services later. During that module, you'll actually see us deploy these different templates to our infrastructure so that we can start using them, start configuring them.
And just to be clear, this has nothing to do with Service Manager. This is the service concept within Virtual Machine Manager. So I think we're about ready. We're about done here for this module.
Yep, we're going to take a break. It's now lunchtime for us in sunny Redmond. So we're going to be away for approximately an hour, and we'll be starting back up at the next half of the hour. We'll see you again soon.
Got my lunch right here.
Nice.
We're good.